Yeah, we're finally getting our second 5-star Ice DPS since 1.4, and she's just a little strong to say the least. Hello everyone, the version 5 beta for 3.0 came out a while back with some very appreciated buffs to both our characters. Though it's version 6 now, it just had wording and some translation fixes. I'll first go over Aglaea's buffs real quick and then spend most of the video going over the final version of Herta. If you don't know Aglaea's kit or the changes made in version 3, I recommend you checking out my previous video. Also, I apologize how this video is coming out super late, but happy late New Year's. The TLDR for Aglaea is that she's now at her version 1 peak and stronger than version 3 when she got nerfed. Firstly, Garment Maker's initial speed is now tied to Aglaea's final speed instead of her base speed. While version 3 had Garment Maker sitting at 35 or 40 speed, it now has varying speeds, with 35 being the bare minimum and an average of 76, assuming 6 speed stacks with Aglaea. Here's a chart showing how much speed it will have based on Aglaea. But basically, this should just give Garment Maker 41 more speed than version 3 at max stacks. This is also coupled with the speed talent buff, now increasing Garment Maker speed by 55 instead of 50, meaning 30 more speed at max stacks. Assuming version 3 Garment Maker had 335 speed, version 5 now gets to 406ish, which is slightly better than version 1 at 400. This is of course great because more damage and energy is generated, plus you're also getting around 256 more attack from the attack talent, bringing it from around 2750 to 3000 from her passive. There's also this discovery, but basically it's just saying that Garment Maker will not get a speed increase if Aglaea gets a speed buff from a teammate in combat, but rather how it needs to get the speed buff themselves. The best example I can think of would be E2 Bronya, which if used on Aglaea won't give Garment Maker that 30% speed. This isn't too important now, but it's something to note. Next, her enhanced basic attack multiplier for adjacent targets also got increased by 12%, going from 80 to 90. The total multiplier has gone from 720 from version 3 to 760, which is a 5.5% damage increase. This is now just slightly weaker than version 1, but it's still very nice. Lastly, her E1 and E2 got swapped around, with E1 now providing a 15% vulnerability, which got buffed by 1%. We of course still get the 20 energy per attack, but what I didn't realize, and a comment in my prior video pointed out, was how Aglaea's enhanced basic attack is a joint attack, which actually triggers this twice, which means her attacks in her Supreme Stance form generate additional 40 energy for a total of 60, while Garment Maker still of course gives 40. With this change, I honestly would prioritize snagging E1 as you can consistently stay in her Supreme Stance as well as potentially get more extra turns. And her E2 is now the defense shred one if she or Garment Maker acts consecutively. But yeah, that's all for Aglaea. She and Herta are the only characters in recent memory that actually got a version 5 buff, unlike everyone else who got either wording changes or even nerfs. Though it isn't the biggest deal, ending it on a positive note is a nice change of pace. But yeah, our 3.0 DPSs will 100% be at the top of the meta. Now let's move on to the main topic of today, that being Big Herta herself, who likely will be fighting for the best DPS title. Of course, that's a pretty bold claim, so let's see why this may be the case. Starting with her base stats, her HP and defense stats aren't too important, so we'll just be ignoring those. Her attack is very high at 679, tied with the likes of Yunli, Kafka, and Yan King. While she is fairly slow, just like Jin Liu, she does have speed traces which bumps her to 104 speed, making her above average at 18th place. But as you may have noticed, she has a very high energy cost, putting her alongside the likes of Firefly and Yun Li. But worry not, as this isn't too big of an issue as I'll get to later. Moving on, Herta's kit revolves all around this thingy called interpretation. So let's talk about her talent, Hand 'em Over. At the start of the wave, inflict 25 interpretation to a random enemy, which prioritizes elites and bosses. This was shifted from her technique in version 5, which is a very nice change and buff because it means that you will now always start with high amount of stacks in battle, which greatly helps when you're doing things that don't allow you to use your technique such as relic domains. Also, when an enemy enters battle, inflict 1 interpretation stack. So what exactly does this interpretation do? Well, looking at point 3, when using your enhanced skill, it increases its multiplier based on the amount of stacks, and depending if you have an Erudition teammate, increase the multiplier gain by double. As you could assume, you need an Erudition teammate just like how Acheron needs Nihility teammates. Also, after you use your enhanced skill, reset the interpretation stacks on the main target to 1. There is a cap of 42 stacks which keeps your enhanced skill balanced, or else it'd have too big of a multiplier. But how much exactly would this increase your damage? Well, it increased the enhanced skills multiplier by nearly 1000% in an average scenario, which is as much as a 10 stack Lightning Lord. Yeah, and this is before counting its base multiplier. Moving on to point 6, we can see that if an enemy dies, transfer the stacks to an enemy, prioritizing the elite or boss mobs just like the picture I drew. This is important because in the right scenario, the main target will almost always have 42 stacks. Understanding that, let's move on to her 2 traces, which is important to her stack generation. With trace 1, Aloofly Honest, this lets allies generate 1 interpretation stack for enemies they hit. And for each enemy hit, this will give Herta 3 energy with a maximum of 15 for 5 targets hit. For part 3, if Herta uses her enhanced skill when the main enemy has max stacks, she'll get an additional 50% damage bonus for the attack. This was added in version 3 and is a sizable buff. Her trace 2 pairs with her first trace and states if your team has 2 erudition characters, give the team the following buffs. 1. All allies gain 80 crit damage. 2. Ally attacks and the trace Aloofly Honest will calculate a minimum of 3 targets. This just means that even if you attack only 1 enemy, Herta will still regenerate 9 energy. 3. Trace 1 will now apply an additional stack on the enemy with the highest amount of stacks, with an additional 2 more if the character is erudition. This means that normal allies will apply 2 stacks for the main target, while erudition units will apply 4. This of course applies to Herta as well. As you can see with these traces, Herta generally will not be struggling to gain these stacks or even energy. That's why I said don't worry about that 220 ult cost. But with that out the way, we can just move on to her attacks. Her basic, did you get it, is just like any other basic. But unlike other basic attacks, there actually may be times when you utilize it, though it may not happen too often. You sometimes may opt to use this attack to save your enhanced skill and wait until you have 42 stacks to get that damage bonus from her trace. Her normal skill, Big Brain, is a single blast and AoE attack as it has 3 separate damage instances. Firstly, Herta attacks one enemy for 70% of her attack and applies 1 stack of interpretation. After that, she deals another 70% to the main target and those that were adjacent, for a total of 210% in a blast pattern. But this happens twice. As such would now be an AoE with another multiplier of 350% for a final multiplier of 630, which is nearly a facial ult in the skill itself, which is pretty crazy considering she has an enhanced version. Now let's move on to her ult, which does a few things. Firstly, we rearrange the interpretation stacks which now prioritize elite plus enemies. I'll put on screen how it should look before and after when you ult with Herta. One thing to note is that if the main target has 42 stacks, it will assign the rest to the next highest rarity or just a random enemy. Just know that this attack has its own brain and won't rearrange it in the way you may expect it to sometimes, as shown on screen. From the ult, Herta also gains 3 more things. Firstly, she'll gain 80% attack for 3 turns, which was buffed from version 3, which had 64% attack and 2 turns. Assuming you play it right, you essentially can have a permanent 80% attack bonus or around 1000 attack when using Herta. Next, she gains 100% action advance and also 1 stack of inspiration, not interpretation. Consuming 1 inspiration stack will now let you use her enhanced skill. There is a cap of 4, but you probably won't ever cap this out unless it's like the simulated universe or you have her E2. As you may have noticed, I've skipped the damage multiplier. This is because you have to pair it with her third trace, which increases her ult multiplier based on how many interpretation stacks that have been generated in battle. While it does vary, it's basically gonna be at 99 for most of the battle. So normally it hits all enemies for 200% of Herta's attack, but in practice it's gonna be 299% on every enemy. So against 5 enemies, this attack has a multiplier of 1495%. Not much to say, but very big PP multiplier. But there's something even bigger, her enhanced skill, Hear Me Out. This attack is basically the same as her normal skill, but with a slightly higher multiplier of 80 instead of 70. But looking at her chart, we can now see that there are 2 more damage instances. The first is from the skill itself, which does an additional 40% attack to all enemies. Nothing too big. The second, and the main star of the show, will be the final hit, which has the massive multiplier from the Hand 'em Over talent. Now, how exactly potent is this move? Well, assuming the main target has 42 stacks and the adjacent enemies have 10, the final multiplier with an erudition unit comes out to a total of 1912%. This number of course can vary higher or lower, but I'll use this as the rough average. Regardless, it's still very massive PP damage. I'll talk a bit more about this later and her damage in relation to someone like Acheron, but for now we'll be moving on to her technique. When casting Vibe Checker, it does 3 different things. The first is for combat, which when entering battle would increase Herta's attack by 60% for 2 turns. This was buffed in version 5, going from 40 to 60%, which is a pretty nice buff. But in my opinion, this aspect of the technique isn't too impactful. While it's a very sizable increase in attack, it doesn't last that long as you could assume. From what I've seen, this basically will only apply to her first 2 skills and sometimes the ult too if you can cast a second skill and the ult at the same time. Moving to the next function, it marks up to 3 chests in the overall, which is gonna give Topaz a run for her money. And lastly, like Rame, it'll delete common enemies in the simulated universe. Moving on to her Eidolons, her E1 actually got a straight buff in version 5 and can be broken down to 2 parts. Firstly, when using her enhanced skill, the stack count for the primary target will now be reset to 15. The main change was that she gained 5 more stacks from version 3 and 15 more than version 1. The 10 stack requirement from version 3 was a non-factor unless you were purposely trying to not get the stacks. The second part that was changed states that when you used her enhanced skill, increase the calculated interpretation stacks by a certain percent. I'll show a drawing to explain this part cause it's easier that way. As you can see in version 3, the side fish and the main guy got increased interpretation stacks. But when comparing it to version 5, only the main target got a big increase in interpretation. This is also a buff as although 60% is more than 50, 30% of probably low stacks on the side enemy probably wouldn't have done you much good. Overall, assuming you have 42 stacks on the primary target, this would increase the multiplier by 336%. While this may not be the biggest damage increase in an AoE scenario as the total multiplier is around 1900, which comes around to a 18% damage increase, in a single target scenario, it actually comes to a 36% damage increase. Overall, it's a great Eidolon, but just remember, you're still held back by one thing, that being your inspiration stacks, which is of course tied to her ult. Even if you get 42 stacks faster, it won't matter if you don't have inspiration. That's where E2 comes in. Nothing changed from version 3 to 6 besides wording, but it's a pretty simple Eidolon regardless. After casting the ult, gain 1 extra inspiration. This is where the 4 inspiration stacks you can carry comes in. You also gain a 35% action advance after you ult. Yeah, this basically just lets you nuke twice. E4 on the other hand is actually more doogie than usual. E6 provides res pen and a ult based buff based on the amount of enemies on the field. But that's everything regarding your kit. I can now give my thoughts on Big Herta. It's a bit tricky since she'll be the best DPS because it'll really depend on the enemy lineup. If it's single target, then facial follow-up or butthole would of course be the strongest. But when we move to AoE, she'll probably be the strongest and slightly above the likes of Rappa and Acheron. But as you could assume, she's gonna be very strong. Now, the reason why I think she's so strong is for a few reasons. One, the clear answer is that she simply has the biggest multipliers. Comparing to Acheron, while Acheron only has 1 nuke in the form of her ult, Herta has 2 with her ult and enhanced skill. Next would be the ability to use Robin. Herta can be seen as the AoE version of Fei Xiao, both wanting a sub DPS and Robin. And Robin is OP, and many top DPSs are unable to utilize her because of them being break DPS or Acheron, who really wants that second agility. Lastly, I think her being an energy related DPS is very nice as she can greatly benefit from taking lots of damage to battery herself, unlike Acheron or Fei Xiao who are kinda locked in place. In regards to the future, I think she has a lot of room to grow in the same way that Acheron does. Currently speaking, they're missing their second best in slot support. While Acheron has Jiao Chou, she's still reliant on the likes of Pela, which isn't bad, but it could be better. Herta, on the other hand, really wants a supported Erudition unit who could focus more on support rather than dealing damage. Ideally, we get something along the lines of an AoE Topaz who can act multiple times, stacking up interpretation and boosting Herta's personal damage somehow. I do think she's gonna age just fine, but let's talk about how strong she is right now. And we can do that by simply comparing to Acheron. Here's my chart with all the assumptions. I'm giving them both just 1 substat roll for everything, which is the bare minimum. For Acheron, she has both Jiao Chou and Pela, while Herta only really has Robin in regards to personal damage for now in the scenario I'm testing. Looking at their final numbers, we can see that Herta with Robin has higher stats, especially in the attack and damage bonus department. But Acheron still has the vulnerability, defense shred, and also res pen. Putting it in a calculator, we can see that Acheron would hit 870k with an ult. Herta, on the other hand, would only hit for 430k, which is a lot less than Acheron. But let's see how it would play out if we included the ult nuke. As you can see, it will now hit for 770k in total. Mind you, in this scenario, Acheron has 2 supports while Herta only has 1. Now, when it comes to how fast they'll get their ult off, I assume it's around the same, assuming their ideal scenario. This scenario also isn't including teammates damage, which would actually put this in favor of Herta. Overall, I would definitely say that she deserves the title of an Emanator and really goes to show how much potential she has. And that's everything. I really appreciate you for waiting on the upload and watching. I hope this new format was a bit easier to digest and more pleasing to look at. Because there isn't too much interesting content to cover right now in Genshin or Honkai, I think I'll instead do a live stream this Friday just playing whatever games or whatever y'all would like to see. I am saving the new MOC so I can do a live, and I'm also planning to kill the new local legends in Genshin because I haven't really tackled that yet. The 3.1 kits also should drop on the 13th, which kinda sucks because that's literally when my school starts, but regardless, I'll of course try to do my best to cover it. But with that, I bid y'all adieu.